Hi, my name is Carlos. I'm a web developer based in Brooklyn, New York, and today I want to talk about user stories. Now, if you end up working in a team that uses an agile methodology to building their product or their application, you're going to be using user stories a lot. So if you're not sure exactly what they are, then you've come to the right place. So let's go ahead and dig in a little deeper into what they are and how they're actually used in the process of building a product or an application.
So, what are user stories exactly? Well, user stories are a few sentences in simple language that outline the desired outcome. Now, data go into detail and they're told from the perspective of the person who desires a new capability. And usually they're written in post it notes or index cards to emphasize that its length should be short, concise, and simple to understand. Now, the purpose of user stories is to articulate how a piece of work will deliver a particular value back to the customer. So it's considered more of an end goal. And due to this, it has three important elements. Usually, a user story focuses on the who, the what, and the why. So we can look at a quick example here. As a consumer, I want shopping cart functionality to easily purchase items online. Here we have a clear understanding of type of functionality that we want from the user's perspective and its purpose. So let's go in a little bit more depth into why they're useful. Now, when building a product for a customer, some methodologies provide a large spec of requirements. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing, and it depends on what you're building. But for some products, it's useful to have some flexibility and be able to adapt. This is why user stories can be very practical. If a team is working with user stories, there's usually a story writing workshop near the start of the project. And not only does the team participate, but the client also takes part in the goal of creating concise pieces of information to produce a backlog that fully describes the functionality of the application. Now, user stories themselves are actually agile. And if you're not familiar with agile development, I highly suggest you check out the video on the topic in the link in the description. But what exactly makes them agile, and what is their purpose in agile development? Well, in order to understand this, let's look at some differences between waterfall and agile development. Two of the most popular development methodologies are waterfall and agile development, and there are a few key differences that make them distinct. First of all, in waterfall development, we have a more sequential approach, meaning that progress flows in largely one direction or downwards like a waterfall. Whereas in agile development, we have a numerous iterations. Work is broken into sprints or iterations, which are short timeframes that involve a cross-functional team working in all aspects of the product, from design, coding, and testing. In waterfall development, we also have large documentation and a very long list of spec requirements. Whereas in Agile, we use user stories. So instead of using large documentations, we use these stories to help organize the understanding of the system being built. Now, due to the large documentation in Waterfall, there's also low customer involvement since the team already has the spec of requirements that is needed for the application to work. Whereas in Agile development, since we work with iterations, we want the customer to interact with us and be able to talk through what needs to be changed. Now, this leads us to one of the most important key differences between Waterfall and Agile. Since waterfall relies on progress flowing unidirectionally, there's no flexibility in the process and changes in the product have to be avoided. Whereas in agile development, since we're working with iterations and user stories, there exists the ability to adapt to change and break down what worked and didn't work at the end of each iteration. So maybe we can reprioritize with user stories what needs to be done in order to get the full functionality of the app. Now, a key component of agile software development is putting people first, and user stories put actual end users at the center of a conversation. Now, there are many advantages to this, but let's look at a few of them. For starters, we're able to actually talk with precision. Let's say you walk into a restaurant and you open up a menu, and one of the entrees has a description that says, entree comes with the choice of soup or salad and bread. Now, to whoever wrote this, it might be very clear and obvious what they meant, but to readers, there might be different interpretations. One of them might be that the entree comes with the soup and a choice of salad or bread, and the other one might be that there's a choice of soup or salad and bread. Dealing with documentation and little interaction with the customers, it can be very confusing to understand what exactly they want. So, user stories allow us to have consistent communication with our clients to have little room for ambiguity and misunderstanding. One other advantage to user stories is the fostering of collaboration. Now, good user stories, due to their minimalistic characteristic, inherently give way to collaboration among the product development team, the product owner, and the users of the product. While the traditional teams depend heavily on detailed documents and electronic tools, most agile teams collaborate with users to plan, implement, and deliver customer value. Lastly, with each customer value delivering user story, the product is built incrementally. Now, building the product incrementally allows to rapidly adjust it to a new direction. When sliced in smaller ideas to experiment, user stories allow for quick implementation and user feedback. So, through Agile's ability to adapt, user stories allow for easy addition and removal of features from the product. That way, if changes need to be made, we can actually prioritize, and from there, we can reorganize the backlog for the next sprint. Now, how do we write a user story? Well, Mike Cohn, one of the inventors of the Scrum methodology and author of User Stories Applied, provide a more formal approach to writing user stories in order to keep things very simple and straightforward. His format goes as follows. As a who, I want what, so that why. And remember, this goes back to the key components that make up a user story that focus on the who, the what, and the why. Now, let's look at an example of what makes a good user story and what makes a bad one. Let's pretend we're building a Formula One game, and someone comes up with a user story that says, as a player, I want to be able to compete in a race. Now, there are a few things in this user story that make it a bad user story. Well, for starters, it's very generic. If we're building a Formula One game, it's kind of self explanatory that we want to be able to compete in a race. Secondly, there's no purpose or why. Due to its generic aspect of it, there's no actually specific purpose of why this user story is needed. And lastly, there's no specifics, so we don't really know when this user story is complete because it's made up of a bunch of different user stories. It's very generic and vague. So if we break this down into numerous user stories, we can come up with very specific ones that make sense. For example, as a player, I want to be able to see a map so that I can know my position and or place in the race. Here we have a very clear understanding as to what we're trying to make, what it's for, and to who it's serving its purpose. So what exactly happens after a user story is complete? Well, let's go through the life cycle of a user story. So generally near the start of a project, there's a story writing workshop where everyone sits down, talks out the application, its functionalities, and they come up with stories. Usually a story is written by a product owner, a product manager, or a program manager, and then submitted for review. Once all the stories are accumulated, you can prioritize the items and create a sort of backlog in order to make a to-do list of what needs to be done, what is in the process of being done, and what is completed. From there, the team decides when a user story is completed using what we call an acceptance criteria. An acceptance criteria is basically a set of statements, each with a clear pass or fail result that specify both functional and non-functional requirements. So let's look at how an acceptance criteria is used to ensure that a user story is completed. Let's go back to the example of our Formula One game. Let's say one of the developers took the user story to complete the map in order to track the players in the race game. So now that the user story is complete, it has to go through an acceptance criteria. And the acceptance criteria has 3 points. One is that the map is placed on the bottom right corner of the game. Two is that it should have a border and be sized at 380 pixels by 380 pixels. And lastly, that it should show all the players with different colored markers. Now, an acceptance criteria might be more elaborate and have a lot more points, but this is just an example so you get the idea of how they work. Now, once the functionality of all that acceptance criteria is completed, you can consider that user story done. So, what's the end goal with user stories? Well, the goal is to build the application in the way that the user sees value in order to minimize risk. Now, user stories allow us to break down the process of the workflow into a few discrete actions, and this enables us to prioritize a customer with continuous delivery. Now, just to keep in mind that the user story is simply a guideline and it sometimes can be quite rigid, so it's okay to derail from the template as long as you keep the agile principles in mind.
So hopefully this video gave you a better understanding as to what user stories are and how they're used. So thank you all for watching. Join the conversation by subscribing to this channel or dropping a comment below. And if you want to take your skills to the next level, start learning on Codecademy today.